July 8th, 2026, Ankara, Turkey. Donald Trump is standing next to NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte at the alliance's annual summit, and a reporter asks him a simple question. Is the ceasefire with Iran still holding? His answer is not diplomatic. For me, I think it's over, he says. As far as I'm concerned, it's just a waste of time. 48 hours later, he goes further, posting that the United States has told Tehran, in his words, in no uncertain terms, that the ceasefire is over. That single social media post ends 3 weeks of fragile calm, a calm that had been bought with a memorandum of understanding, signed after 12 straight days of direct war between two nuclear-capable rivals, a dead supreme leader, and thousands of bodies still being counted from Tehran to Beirut. Here's the problem. Most people watching this unfold on the news are being told a very simple story. Iran broke the ceasefire, America is punishing it, and Israel is a bystander watching its enemy get dismantled. That is the mainstream framing. And it is not wrong, exactly, but it is incomplete in a way that matters enormously. Because while the cameras were fixed on Washington and Tehran, 3 other fronts quietly opened around Israel's own borders: Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq. And intelligence now suggests Iran has told its allies to get ready for something bigger. So the real question isn't just, is the war back on? It's this: is Israel now facing exactly the scenario it spent 50 years trying to prevent? A coordinated, multi-front war on every side at once. Let's actually walk through the evidence, because the answer is more complicated and more unsettling than either side of this debate wants to admit. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel exists for exactly this kind of analysis. Not the 90-second headline version, not the outrage bait version, but the version where we slow down, follow the timeline, and separate what we actually know from what people are assuming. I'm Jiang, and I read primary sources, wire reports, government statements, live briefings from the ground, so that what you get here isn't recycled talking points. It's the underlying structure of the story. If that's useful to you, the subscribe button and the notification bell are how you make sure you don't miss the next one. Because this situation is moving fast enough that next week's video might already be out of date by the time it posts. So let's set the scene properly, because you cannot understand July 2026 without understanding February 2026. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched a joint military operation against Iran. This wasn't a symbolic strike. The opening salvo took out the head of the Iranian state itself. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed in the first wave. Within hours, Iran responded with hundreds of retaliatory missiles and thousands of drones fired across the region, not just at Israel, but at American assets and Gulf Arab states as well. What followed became known as the 12-Day War, and then, as it dragged on, simply the 2026 Iran War. The human cost was staggering even by Middle East standards. Thousands dead in Iran and Lebanon, dozens more in Israel and the Gulf states, and in Lebanon specifically, more than 1/6 of the entire population displaced from their homes after the war reignited the long-simmering conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. By June, exhaustion and international pressure produced a memorandum of understanding, a deal built around one central bargain. Iran would stop threatening the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that carries roughly 1/5 of the entire world's oil supply. And in exchange, the pressure campaign against Tehran would ease. On paper, that was the off-ramp. In practice, Iran almost immediately began testing it, warning commercial vessels that they had to follow IRGC-approved routes through the strait, essentially asserting the kind of toll booth control over international waters that no ceasefire agreement gave it the right to claim. On July 6th and 7th, that testing turned violent. Iranian forces fired on 3 separate commercial vessels in the strait. Within days, the IRGC Navy went further and formally declared the Strait of Hormuz closed altogether, citing what it called American interference. That is the spark that set off the July escalation. Not a single dramatic betrayal, but a slow-motion unraveling that both sides now blame on each other. Now here's where I want to introduce the lens I think actually explains what's happening, because most coverage treats each of these flashpoints, Hormuz, Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, as separate stories. I don't think they are. I call this the pressure valve model of the Iran war. The idea is simple. Iran cannot win a direct, sustained war against the United States and Israel's combined air power. It knows this. What it can do is open enough smaller valves around the region, enough simultaneous pressure points, that its opponents are forced to spread their attention, their munitions, and their political capital thin. Every new front isn't necessarily a sign of Iranian strength. It can just as easily be a sign of Iranian desperation, an attempt to make the cost of continuing the war higher than the cost of stopping it. Keep that framework in mind, because I think it explains almost every move we're about to walk through. And it's the difference between reading this as Iran is winning versus Iran is trying not to lose. Let's go through the fronts one at a time, because the details matter here more than the headlines. Front number one is Lebanon. In early March, just days after the war with Iran itself began, Israel opened direct hostilities against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. This wasn't a few airstrikes. It escalated into sustained ground combat, most notably what's now referred to as the Battle of Khiam, involving Israeli ground forces, including the 91st Division and the Givati Brigade, against Hezbollah's military wing and its Radwan Special Forces unit. That battle, as of this recording, is still ongoing. It never fully stopped, even during the weeks when the Iran ceasefire was technically holding, which tells you something important. Hezbollah's front was never really part of the US-Iran deal to begin with. It's been simmering the entire time, a fire nobody actually put out, just one that got less media attention while Hormuz dominated headlines. Front number two is Yemen. On March 28th, the Houthi movement announced it was rejoining the fight, launching ballistic missiles at what it called sensitive military targets inside Israel. Their spokesman was explicit about the coordination, stating the operation was carried out alongside Iran and Hezbollah, and warning that strikes would continue until, in his words, the aggression on all resistance fronts stops. That's not vague solidarity language, that's a stated alliance structure. Israeli air defenses intercepted the launches. Air raid sirens sounded as far south as Eilat and the Negev desert, and by early April, the Houthis had claimed a third round of missile attacks, explicitly framing themselves as opening another pressure point alongside Iran and Hezbollah. The significance here isn't really about damage done. Israeli interception rates have been high. It's about geography. The Houthis control Yemen's western coastline, which means they can threaten the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a second global shipping choke point. At the same time, Iran is squeezing the first one at Hormuz. That's not a coincidence. That's two of the world's most important oil arteries being leaned on simultaneously by the same alliance network. Front number three is Iraq, and this one is murkier, but it matters. In mid-July, strikes in Iraq's Kurdistan region killed 8 members of an Iranian Kurdish opposition group, a group that has spent years operating in exile, opposed to the regime in Tehran. The exiled party blamed Iran directly for the attack. Now, this isn't Iran opening a new front against Israel. It's Iran using the chaos of a wider regional war to settle old scores against its internal opposition operating just across the border. But strategically, it tells us something about how far Iran's willingness to project force has expanded during this conflict. A regime under existential pressure from Washington and Jerusalem is still finding the bandwidth to conduct operations against dissidents in a neighboring country. That's either a sign of remarkable resilience or a sign that the regime feels it has nothing left to lose by escalating on every axis available to it. And which of those two readings is correct genuinely determines how this war ends. Now let me pause here and do the thing I think separates real analysis from fear-mongering, because there's a strong temptation in this kind of video to just stack up front after front and tell you the sky is falling. Let's be fair to the other side of this. It is entirely possible that what we're watching is not a masterfully coordinated Iranian offensive, but a fragmented, opportunistic set of actors, each pursuing their own local interests under a loose Iranian umbrella. The United Nations' own special envoy for Yemen warned the Houthis directly against dragging the country into what he called a broader conflict that would bring more suffering to Yemeni people. And notably, the Houthis hesitated for weeks before actually joining, showing real reluctance to fully commit. Hezbollah, similarly, has kept its participation largely confined to the Lebanese theater, rather than escalating into the kind of full drone and missile barrage into central Israel that would mark true regional war. If Iran's proxy network were as tightly coordinated and confident as the scariest headlines suggest, you would expect these groups to have opened every front simultaneously and at full intensity back in February. Instead, what we've seen is staggered, incremental escalation, which looks a lot more like a network testing limits than a network executing a unified war plan. Keep that caveat in your pocket, because it's going to matter for how we read what comes next. And what comes next is the piece of intelligence that's actually driving the most serious concern right now among people who watch this region closely. Reporting out of the region in the past week indicates that Iran has told Hezbollah and its other regional allies to prepare for the possibility of a considerably wider conflict. Language specifically raising the prospect that Israel could be pulled into direct, sustained fighting beyond the current skirmishing. fishing. If that reporting holds up, it changes the pressure valve model I described earlier. It would mean Iran isn't just opening pressure points to buy itself leverage at the negotiating table. It may be preparing its entire network for the scenario where diplomacy fails completely, and this becomes the true multi-front war Israel has planned around for decades. That's the nightmare scenario in Israeli strategic thinking, and it's worth explaining why, because it isn't really about the military math of any single front. Israel's air defense systems, Iron Dome, David Sling, Arrow, are extremely effective, but they were designed with certain assumptions about volume and timing. A single missile from Yemen is intercepted with ease. Sustained, simultaneous barrages from Lebanon, Yemen, and Iran, all at once, over an extended period, is a fundamentally different resource allocation problem. And it's the specific scenario every Israeli defense planning document for the last 2 decades has flagged as the true worst case. Meanwhile, the American side of this has been escalating in its own right, and this is where the Strait of Hormuz becomes the economic center of gravity for the entire story. After Iran's attacks on commercial shipping and its declaration that the strait was closed, the U.S. response wasn't limited to symbolic gestures. As of this recording, American forces have struck Iran for 7 consecutive nights, and the target set has visibly expanded beyond military infrastructure into transportation and logistics, bridges, and reportedly infrastructure at Chabahar port on Iran's Gulf of Oman coastline. Images of which circulated after U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth posted footage appearing to show a structure collapsing there. Iran, in turn, has claimed it targeted American radar systems and military aircraft stationed in Qatar, describing it as punishment against what it called the aggressor. This is no longer a contained exchange over a shipping lane. It's a broadening campaign where each side is reaching further into the other's infrastructure with every passing night. And the rhetoric from Washington has hardened to match. Trump has publicly floated resuming a naval blockade and even referenced the idea of the U.S. taking control of Karg Island, one of Iran's most important oil export terminals. Language that would have been unthinkable restraint-wise just a few months earlier. So where does that leave us, and what should you actually be watching for going forward? I'd point you to 3 specific indicators. First, watch the Houthi tempo. If missile launches out of Yemen start happening on a near daily basis, rather than in occasional spaced-out bursts, that's your clearest signal the pressure valve model has shifted into something closer to full coordination. Second, watch whether Hezbollah's involvement stays confined to the Battle of Khiam and the southern Lebanese border, or whether it starts firing longer-range rockets towards central Israeli population centers the way it did in earlier wars. That's the line between a contained border conflict and genuine multi-front war. Third, and probably most important, watch the diplomatic track. A source with knowledge of the talks indicated another round of U.S.-Iran negotiations was expected to take place, possibly in Switzerland, even as the military escalation continued. That's actually a meaningful signal, because it means neither side has fully closed the door on a deal, even while trading strikes. Wars where the back channel goes completely silent are the truly dangerous ones. Wars where people are still scheduling meetings in Geneva while bombing each other's ports are, paradoxically, often closer to some kind of resolution than they look from the outside. Let's be honest about what we don't know, because that matters too. We don't know whether the prepare for wider conflict messaging to Hezbollah reflects an actual Iranian decision to escalate, or whether it's contingency planning, the kind any military organization does, regardless of whether it intends to use it. We don't know whether the Houthis' pattern of hesitation reflects genuine reluctance to fully commit, or simply operational limits on how much ordnance they have left after years of previous conflicts in Yemen. And we don't know whether Trump's harder rhetoric about Karg Island and naval blockades is a genuine shift in U.S. strategy, or a pressure tactic designed to force Iran back to serious negotiations in Switzerland. Anyone telling you they know for certain how this resolves in the next month is guessing. What we can say with confidence is that the number of active fronts has grown since February. The rhetoric on all sides has hardened rather than softened. And the specific scenario Israeli defense planners have feared for decades, simultaneous multi-front pressure, is closer to plausible today than it has been at almost any point in this conflict. I want to leave you with something to actually think about, rather than just scroll past, because that's usually where these videos lose their value. Here's my question for the comments. Based on everything we just walked through, do you think Iran is executing a coordinated strategy across Lebanon, Yemen, Hormuz, and Iraq? Or do you think this is a regime improvising under pressure and hoping the pieces add up to leverage it doesn't actually control? I genuinely don't think the answer is obvious, and I want to hear how you're reading the evidence. Drop your read in the comments, because the discussion under these videos is honestly some of the best analysis on the platform. Now, next video, I want to go deep on something we only touched briefly here, the Strait of Hormuz itself. Why roughly a fifth of the world's oil physically has to pass through a channel Iran can threaten at will, and what actually happens to global energy markets if that closure becomes semi-permanent rather than a 2-week standoff. That's a much bigger story than most coverage is giving it credit for, and it deserves its own full breakdown. If you want to make sure you catch it, hit subscribe and tap the bell, because I don't post on a fixed schedule. I post when there's something worth actually explaining properly. And given how fast this situation is moving, that might be sooner than you'd expect. Thanks for watching all the way through. I'll see you in the next one.